At that time, Apple kind of barely had a pulse, right? I mean, the world had gone a different direction. And he goes back, and if you read the story, it's interesting, this crescendo it came to. He's walking through the halls of Apple and looking at all this stuff, and what he discovers is there's 30-something versions of the Macintosh. And he starts asking the question, okay, so if I want to tell my nephew to buy one, which one do I tell him to buy? There's 30-something. And so he's looking at this. He brings everybody into a room in classic Jobs style. He screams at them, and he says, this is crazy. And what he does is he gets a whiteboard, and he draws a matrix up there, a 2x2 matrix, 4 quadrants. And across the top, he writes personal and professional. And down the side, he writes desktop and portable. He said, that's what we're going to do. We're going to build 4 computers. And when they wrote the story, what they said was the silence in the room was deafening. And I'm telling you, part of it was deafening because the brains got the clutter out. If you go into an Apple store today, that's what you find. You find basically 4 computers. What are the 4 things in your marriage, in your spiritual life, in your relationship, in your company, that need to be attended to? Because what he did was he made them attend to what was relevant, shut out everything else, and keep that current. So talk about that in your relationships, in your community. What is it we're trying to build, and what needs our attention? Because the way God has designed us, he designed us to be purposeful like he is. So think about that first one. The second one, the brain basically not only needs to attend and to focus, but the brain, in order for the higher functions of the brain to work, and by higher functions, I mean the stuff you need, your creativity, your problem solving, your judgment, your evaluative capacities, your abilities to initiate and work a plan to completion, to follow through, to change and to solve obstacles. All of those capacities, they live in a region of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. And that's where all the smart stuff lives. That's what when you hire people, that's what you're paying for, all right? So here's what happens. That's one section of the brain as God designed it. The other brain, you have something called the lower brain, and it's designed to basically do exactly the opposite. This one thinks, this one refrains from thinking and reacts. Okay? It's basically designed, and here's the key for you to remember in your relationships and in your work. Here's the key. This brain is designed to only do 2 things: to fight or flight. Fight or flight. And it kicks in when we're under threat. When we get under threat, cortisol and a bunch of chemicals are released in the brain, and your brain goes away from thinking and judgment and options and choosing the best way and intuition and all of that stuff. The stress hormones that get released under threat shut this one down like a circuit breaker and activate the reactive brain, the fight or flight. Now, why did God make it this way? Well, think about it. If you're on a train track, you're walking along, you got your knapsack on your back, and you're tooling around on the train, listening to your music, or the track, listening to your music, and all of a sudden you hear this, wah! Train whistle blows, and you're on the track. The last thing you want to do is think, right? You don't want to pull out your calculator and go, how big is the train? What's the velocity? Do I have time to listen to one more song before it hits me? No. Your brain, when you're under threat, it shuts down your thinking, and it causes you to either punch it out or dive off the track. Fight or flight. Why? Because you're in danger. You're under threat. Now, what does this have to do with today? The brain to work for people's hearts, minds, and souls to connect with us, they must be in a positive emotional climate as opposed to a toxic emotional climate that puts them under threat. Now, I'm not talking about fear. Fear is good. good kind of fear. Johnny, if you don't finish your homework by 6, you can kiss the computer goodbye. See, that's good fear of reality consequences. Or if we don't capture market share by June, bad things are going to happen to all of us. That's fine. We need that. I know that if I walk too far out here, I need to be afraid of air, right? I could fall. So I'm not talking about that kind of fear. What I'm talking about is toxic emotional states that every day people put each other under. In marriage, in parenting, sometimes in business, that when we're wanting to work something out with somebody or we're wanting to accomplish a goal, the worst thing that we can do is put them in a toxic emotional state because the brain that we want to be working in them shuts down and they start to fight or flight. So when the boss starts to yell and scream and get mad, or really, and we're not talking about passion. Passion is great. We need passion. We need to get in each other's face sometimes. What I'm talking about is the toxic stuff. The stuff that wounds someone's spirit. The Bible says that a person can survive their sickness, but a broken spirit, who can bear? And sometimes we don't know we're doing this, but our tone and shaming and name-calling and putting people down and sarcasm and anger, the Bible says the anger of man does not accomplish the righteousness of God. And when we're getting toxic, we're hurting not only them, but we're hurting the whole picture because we're getting less of what we want. This is a true story. A guy had built this company, started it from nothing, built it into a big company. And his son was the heir apparent who was going to take over. He was going to retire in a few years, and there was a pretty structured succession plan in place. And the son, was kind of getting there and working on it. And one day, the man, the founder, walks through the factory floor, and he sees his son angrily berating an employee in front of other employees. And he motions to him to come upstairs. So he takes him into his office, and he sits him down. He says, David, I wear 2 hats here. I'm the boss, and I'm your father. Right now, I'm going to put my boss hat on. You're fired. I will not have that in my company. I won't have it in my culture. I won't have people treated that way. I won't have anything that even looks like that people would want to emulate. And I've told you this, and this is nothing new. I have told you this for 2 years, that unless that went away, this was not going to work. I've told you to work on it. I've given you opportunity to get a coach and work on it. So you're done. You're fired. And that's the bottom line. Now, let me put my father hat on for a second. Son, I heard you just lost your job. Can I help you some way? That's a true story. When it was relayed to me, I remember thinking, there's so much right with that, I don't even know where to start. Because what he was doing was we talk about all this positive emotional climate stuff. It can sound like psychobabble, but this is neuroscience. The last thing he wanted was a company that had a culture where people's brains couldn't work. And he knew that he wanted to build a place where great creativity and things could happen. And to do that, people had to feel good about being there. For him to do something that significant, think of the dinner table conversation he was going to have that night when he goes home. Because to get a son like that, there's always an enabling mother somewhere at the table, right? Or a parent. That's going to be an interesting conversation when he goes home. Yeah, I fired our son. That's a big deal. But that's how important it was to him. Why would he do that? Because the brain needs to feel good. And I'm not just talking about fluff here. I'm talking about when they get inside of our heads and they start to look at the chemicals that drive the brain, there are neurotransmitters that are released in positive emotional states that fuel all sorts of bursts of flow, of creativity, of adaptation, of problem solving. But if we feel under threat, all that stuff shuts down. Very, very important. So, in your relatedness, talk to each other. I do this with teams a lot. We could talk about that concept and around the table. When do you guys feel good as a team? When does it get toxic or in the culture of the company? What is it we need to do to think about how we make this a place that's energizing to people? Very important. Relationally at home, in our extended families, or in our work. So what have we looked at? We've looked at attending, and we've looked at a positive emotional climate. Okay? Now let's look at one more. The brain also needs fuel. Your brain basically works on three things. Oxygen, so breathe, that's good. Feel that? Don't you feel smarter after you do that? Oxygen. The second one is glucose. So we need, if your blood sugar drops, you get fuzzy and you can't think. So it's got to have its glucose up there. But the third thing the brain needs in order to work and to fire well is relationship. Do you know the hard brain science? We're not even talking the software. We're talking the literal hardware, the circuitry. Do you know that when they take pictures of the brains of kids that have certain kinds of disorders a little later who were institutionalized or not cared for as babies when the brain was developing and growing, they could have been fed and watered and physically taken care of, but if they did not have connection and bonding and attachment and love, literally there are dark spots in the brain where there should be wiring, where there should be circuitry that did not develop because love was absent. We know this from the womb to the tomb. We can go into, now, in the senior population, neuroplasticity is the term, that our brains are always growing if they are given the right capacities or the right ingredients. And one of those we know is relationship. And it is huge, huge. And I'm going to boil it down to a word, and the word is connection. Connection. And what do I mean by connection? It doesn't mean just that we have people in the room or people in our lives. Sometimes a marriage that's disconnected can be a very, very lonely place. Sometimes a workplace or a team where there's people working together but they don't feel connected can be one of the worst places to spend 50 hours a week. We're not talking about just having people in your life. What we're talking about is where hearts, minds, and souls are really connecting with the things with each other that matter. I'll tell you a story to illustrate this. In 2008, if you remember, it started kind of in the spring. The first one, scary one, was auction rate securities, and then the credit default swaps, and then everything started to unravel throughout 2008. And by the fall, when Lehman and Bear Stearns went down and Wall Street fell, remember that? Everybody's portfolios dropped in half, and the world went into this thing we refer to as the financial crisis. One of my clients was the CEO of one of the Wall Street banks, and I was back there in December of 2008, and Lehman and Bear Stearns had gone down, and all of that was awful, and he's got, 10,000 brokers out there across the country. And he shows me a letter, and it was an angry letter from a client. And what it said was, you guys are all, crooks, you should go to jail, you should all be in prison. And he said, this is what my brokers and financial advisors are getting every day from some clients. He said, these are really good people, and our whole thing that we work on is servicing our clients.